Hello, my friends. Welcome to Lindy's Magpie Reads. I'm here to talk about books. This is the last video that I will make in 2024, and I am not going to talk about my best books of the year. I'm still compiling all of that because I've read so many of them and it's so hard to narrow it down. Yeah. I finished 6 books since my last video, and one of those books is going to make my top books of 2024. So this is why I don't rush and put together my top books of 2024, because what if in the very last week there's one of my best books, which is what happened. I mean, I considered, how can I avoid that? How can I get my best books video done earlier? Well, I could save books that I don't think I'm going to like till the end of the year. And then I think, well, I'm not going to read books that I don't think I'm going to like, so that's no good. What I've done for just these last few days of the year is I have started books and on purpose not finished them. I will finish them in 2025. That way, if I really love them, they will be in the best books of 2025, not 2024. But still, it's so hard to narrow it down. Stay tuned if you want to know how I manage. Anyway, so I do like to look at stats, mostly for my own purposes, but if you're interested, keep listening. If stats don't interest you, there are chapters for the video down below, so timestamps, and you can just go forward if you want to hear about the 6 books that I finished recently. All right, so those of you stat nerds, Storygraph does pie charts for you. I just love it. It just makes it so simple. I used to make my own at the end of every year, and I didn't have to do that this year. So what did I find out? Storygraph assigns mood to books. So I don't know how accurate this is, but a lot of the books that I read are either reflective or emotional, and that sounds accurate enough to me. And the next largest category is informative. And then there's a whole bunch of other mood categories as well, but in much smaller quantities. I like to read books that have a medium pace, so 60% of the books that I read are considered medium pace. And I read 60% fiction, 40% nonfiction. This is a bit different from previous years where the breakdown between the two has been closer to 30% nonfiction. But that's just kind of interesting that I'm been more in the mood for nonfiction this year. And I noticed that a lot of my best books of the year are falling into the nonfiction category as well. Yeah. And as for genres, I read 77 books that are considered literary, 72 that are considered LGBTQIA+, 61 in graphic novel format, 47 that were memoir. I also added my own tags. So under the Canadian tag, I learned that I read 137 books by Canadian authors this year, and 48 books by Indigenous authors, 46 books in translation, and 41 picture books. Okay, enough of the stats. Let's go into books. I've got some great books to tell you about. starting with Vanishing Treasures, a bestiary of extraordinary endangered creatures. It's by Katherine Rundell, and I listened to the audiobook read by Lenny Henry and the author. In the UK, this book is called The Golden Mole, and I believe it's the first book that Katherine Rundell has written for an adult audience. Let me know if I'm mistaken about that. She's a British children's author. I had the pleasure of hearing her in person at the Vancouver Writers' Festival in October. That was a highlight for me. She's such a high energy person and so warm and concerned about the fate of our world and all the creatures in it. And so in this book, which has, I think, about 24 chapters, each chapter features an endangered animal from somewhere in the world. So it's a blend of natural history and mythology and sociology, I guess, and there are literary references, but each chapter is quite short. And I believe that in the printed edition, there are illustrations. So I have my name on the waiting list at the library for the print edition, and I will read it again when I get that. So some of the things that I took note of are the Japanese restaurant Nobu in London. She writes that at the time of writing, it offered bluefin tuna on the menu. And there's what Rundell calls a slimy little asterisk. Bluefin tuna is an endangered species. Please ask your server for an alternative. And then she says, sashimi with a sauce of cognitive dissonance. She writes about how it's the scarcity of bluefin tuna and other animals that gives certain diners a thrill. And she goes in to talk about extinction speculators, men and women with hearts that sing along only to the song of money. Another example she gives is people who collect huge quantities of tiger pelts, so that in the future, when tigers are completely extinct, these pelts will be really valuable. In the seahorse chapter, we learn that seahorses are the only species in the animal kingdom where it's the male who gives birth. And in this chapter, Rundell kind of goes a bit overboard in her enthusiasm, although, I'm not going to fault her for that. But here's what she says. We live in a world of such marvels. We should wake in the morning, and as we put on our trousers, we should remember the seahorse, and we should scream with awe and not stop screaming until we fall asleep. And the same the next day and the next. Each single seahorse contains enough wonder to knock the whole of humanity off its feet if we would but pay attention. So the penultimate chapter is about the golden mole. And this is an animal that is blind, and it's also iridescent. At the end of that chapter, she says, where she's talking about the iridescence, she says, they are not alone in this. The human being, too, is a shining thing. We are infinitesimally bioluminescent. Chemical reactions within the human body cast off photons, the elementary particles of light. The light emitted is 1,000 times weaker than human eyesight, but it is constant and clustered around the face. Like the golden mole, we too have a radiance invisible to ourselves. how can you not feel good? Hearing writing like that, hearing about these kinds of wonders in the world. Next, I want to tell you about the audio edition of a graphic novel. I listened to The Deep Dark by Molly Knox Ostertag. The book is read by a full cast. So this is how graphic novels have been adapted to audio, with not just a full cast, but also sound effects, music. It's quite a unique and rewarding experience. Not the same as actually reading a graphic novel, but certainly very pleasurable. So this story is one that I also want to read in the print format. It's queer magic realism set in the Joshua Tree area. So it's set in the desert, and the main characters are queer. We've got Mags, who's looking after her ailing abuela. She's very butch presenting and Latina, and she has this big secret, shall we say, in her basement. And then there's a friend of hers from when she was young who had left town and comes back. And so this is a trans woman, Nessa, and she's recently come back from Los Angeles. And there's attraction between these two. But Mags is also hooking up with this other girl from high school who has a boyfriend and is keeping Mags a secret. So that gives you enough of the setting. But the, let's say, monster in the basement is a really important aspect of this novel. It's very propulsive. And in the afterword from the author, Molly Ostertag says, "Making this book changed me for the better." And just as a point of interest, Ostertag's spouse is the graphic novelist Andy Stevenson. And the book, I would say, is suitable for age 13 all the way up to adult. And next we have a middle grade novel, The Island of Whispers by Frances Hardinge. She's a British fantasy writer, and in the past, as far as I know, all of her books have been for young adult and big fat novels. My YA book club has read most or all of her previous books, and so somebody suggested that we read this one for our next meeting, even though it's on the young end for YA. It's probably ages 8 to 12, somewhere in there. And this is a much shorter book, almost novella length. It is fantasy. It's kind of a combination of sort of spooky, eerie fantasy and seafaring adventure. It's set on this island where when people die, the ferryman takes them to a place that they need to go, so off the island. And our central character, Milo, is 14. His father is the ferryman, and he is teaching Milo's older brother, Leaf, how to take over. Things happen. Milo is the one who ends up having to get into the boat with these souls, recently departed souls. I loved this book. And it's got illustrations by Emily Gravett. They're sort of like linocut or woodcut type illustrations, very simple graphic designs, but they really add to the atmosphere of it. Misty, spooky, eerie atmosphere. A message of courage and, facing difficult situations. It's just wonderful. I loved it. Highly recommend it. I checked out a digital comic through my library's Hoopla database. It's called Fairies by Yoshitaka Amano, and it's translated from Japanese by Camellia Nieh. Mostly, I just liked the cover and I wanted to see more of the art. I would say the art is gorgeous. Amano is, I think, mostly an animation artist, and his style in this book anyway is very a sort of Art Nouveau, romantic, wispy, delicate lines, and he colored it with colored ink and watercolor, and I think some are acrylic, so a variety of mediums. And they're all short pieces about different Celtic fairies. So, for example, Oberon and Tatiana from A Midsummer Night's Dream, and there's a short little story about them, but lots of images. There's a story about leprechauns, I think mermaids. An afterword in this book is really interesting. So the afterword was written by Kimmie Imura and the same translator. And she writes that the words fairy and elf first permeated Japanese culture in 1902. And she says there's no good Japanese translation for these words, which I found interesting. One of the stories in here is about kidnapping, where fairies would kidnap human babies and replace them with changelings. And another chapter in here is about Merlin and Nimue from the King Arthur legend. And these are important because of the next book I'm going to tell you about. But before I get to that, I just want to mention that I would recommend looking for fairies in the hardcover format, because the digital copy that's in Hoopla, it was published by Dark Horse, when they digitized it, some of the text is really clear, and if it was too small to read, I could pinch and zoom it up bigger for me to make it easier. And some of it, when I would pinch and zoom, it was all blurry. So that's not good. I could still read it, but who wants blurry text? That's not good. All right, on to the next book. This is another great one. It's called Young Hag and the Witch's Quest. It's by Isabel Greenberg. It's a graphic novel. There's her style inside. I love Isabel Greenberg's work. So two of my previous favorites of hers are The Encyclopedia of Early Earth and 100 Nights of Hero. So this one is Arthurian, except it's told from a woman's point of view, which is something that you would expect from Isabel Greenberg. So Morgan Le Fay is telling her own story in here, and our main central character is young hag. She has just turned 12. Oh, what a kick-ass character she is. I just loved her to bits. This is YA and up. I would say probably age 12 and up, maybe even younger. Lots of fun, entertaining, very smart, great book. There's a character in here, by the way, who's named Una. So there's an Una in the last book that I want to tell you about. A character named Una in here as well. It's just weird how that happens. This book has a character named Leaf in it. And Milo's older brother in Island of Whispers by Frances Hardinge, his name is Leaf too. Like, those are not common names. Isn't it weird how I came across them just within a few books? Never mind. Ali Smith, Gliff, so good. This was a gift to me from my friend Kathy. Thank you, Kathy. She knows that I adore Ali Smith's writing. And this book, the physical copy, look, it's got this die-cut opening. And then there's the M papers. And then there's a story about that image. It's by Dora Carrington. It's called Iris Tree on a Horse. And it's from the 1920s. And it's oil ink and silver foil and mixed media on glass. Wow. And that horse is an important image in this story, which has two different timelines, 5 years apart from each other. Both of them are set in the near future, and it's kind of a Brave New World-esque kind of future. It's all Big Brother watching you, cameras everywhere watching, and microphones listening. You have to be really careful of what you say, or bad things happen. And a lot of bad things are happening to people who are different. So much intolerance. There's literal redlining going on, I think referring to the discriminatory practice of redlining neighborhoods in the US, where people couldn't get mortgages if they lived in certain areas. But it's done in, I guess, a playful way in here. Ali Smith is always playful, as well as being politically pointed. So there's a fable-like quality to this, somewhat fantastical, and yet the sentiments that are there, the feelings are so real. We've got a pair of siblings. So in the earlier timeline, the character who's telling the story, the sibling who's telling the story, I guess I will use they, them pronouns, although they're not used in this book. But when this person is asked, "Are you a boy or a girl?" they answer, "Yes." So it's deeply queer, and their younger sister is so special, so adorable. They get separated in the next timeline. There's a bittersweet aspect to this story. there was one short section that's told as if it's a fairy tale that made me cry so much that I had to set the book down until I calmed myself to continue reading. And it's just amazing. I loved it. Yeah, I guess you can tell I loved it. Let me read you just a teeny little bit. All the people living here, including the feral children, were right now unverifiables. They were largely unverifiable because of words. One person here had been unverified for saying out loud that a war was a war when it wasn't permitted to call it a war. Another had found herself declared unverifiable for writing online that the killing of many people by another people was a genocide. Another had been unverified for defaming the oil conglomerates by saying they were directly responsible for climate catastrophe. Another had been unverified for speaking at a protest about people's right to protest. The ferals had been marked unverifiable simply because nobody knew what had happened to their adults and it couldn't be proved who they were. Unverifiable, unverifiable, unverifiable. It's a toxic world, and there's hope that young people are going to sort it out. You got to have hope. So that's all the books I've got to tell you about. But in another one of those coincidences, the short story that I read today from the short story Advent calendar, it's called The Renovation. It's by Kenan Orhan. And this one talks about people in Turkey who are being arrested. My father used to say that they would arrest anyone. He'd been arrested once before, after all, but was let out a year later. He used to say they'd throw you in jail for a bad joke, and while that was true, it had happened before, it had never felt overwhelming. Then, after the coup attempt, they really were arresting everyone. It didn't matter if you were a semi-famous writer or a pop singer with too much flamboyance or just a third-grade teacher. They arrested 50 journalists in the first 2 weeks after the coup attempt. Then the governmental decrees came out, a list of names of everyone who is now dismissed from their jobs as state officials, academics, journalists, teachers, and doctors in state programs, and military cadets and officers. And they were building endless prisons to keep up with it. What kind of world are we living in? Anyway, this is it for 2024. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you for following my channel through this year. I always appreciate hearing from you, so please do say hello in the comments down below. Let me know if you've read any of these books that I've talked about. Are you interested in picking up any of these books? Do you have any other comments? Let me know what your best books are. And do stay tuned for my upcoming video, or possibly more than one video, with my best books tallied up. Love you all. Thanks again. Happy reading, everybody. Bye for now.